It's my last episode of 2016, and I thought, you know what? Let's take a look back at 2016, the year in comics. What was the most popular thing? Well, I wrote down a list of the top selling comics in 2016 to see if we could find any trends and to analyze either the trends or that comic. And one comic did stand out quite a bit. Generally, a good selling comic is selling between 150 to 260,000 copies these days. And you've got your stuff like Walking Dead 150, the first issue of stuff like Spider-Gwen, Batman 1, something called Champions by Marvel. I don't know what that one is. But the absolute best-selling comic of 2016 was in this past June. It was Civil War II #1. It sold 381,737 copies, give or take. There were only two other comics, apparently, that crossed that 300,000 threshold. We've got Harley Quinn 1 in August was 359,000, and then Champions 1 in October was 328,000. But I took a look, and the latest numbers show that both of those comics are only selling in the 50,000 copy range. So they dropped pretty fast, whereas the more recent issues of Civil War II are still selling at least 150,000. So fans, or at least comic book stores, are pretty engaged with this story. I read it, having not read absolutely everything that Marvel and DC publishes these days. I try to keep abreast of the big moves. So I read Civil War II. I didn't personally love it. I think we need to do a deep dive into this. Let's at first take a look at Civil War #1, and we'll look at the tropes of both Brian Bendis, the writer, and a few tropes that you'll find in any given big superhero crossover. So, we've actually covered Brian Bendis before. Let's jump to the past and see what those tropes were. Killing off a main or supporting character, Buffy-esque teen speak. Two-page spread of panels, a page with nothing but multiple panels of talking heads using a different artist for a flashback scene. Decompressed storytelling, or writing for the trade instead of the individual issue. Dialogue pattern that repeats what was just said. The title character fighting crime as a superhero for less than 25% of the issue. Instead of show, don't tell, using a lot of dialogue. Formerly formidable villains being taken down quite easily. A hero calling the villain crazy. Characters speaking out of character, or using phrases that seem wildly unlikely. Okay, and on top of that, we have a few tropes that you could find in all crossovers, including all or almost all of the popular characters showing up, a big, although not necessarily lasting change to the status quo, formerly average villains getting a big power boost. It really is amazing to me how ingrained the crossover has become in modern comic books. At least superhero comics, and certainly from Marvel and DC. Because in the 80s, when I started reading comics, crossovers were pretty rare, and big event comics like Secret Wars and Crisis on Infinite Earths, that was 1986 when that started, and it was a big deal. And they didn't have that every single year. It was more like maybe every 2 years from that point. Although, crossover can mean a lot of things. I'm talking about sort of it's got its own title, or it crosses over through almost all the comics in something like an annual. And they started doing that more and more frequently, but these days, the last 10 years or so, we're talking 1 or 2 events every year that changes the status quo. We're killing off characters, or we're making certain characters illegal, we're sending some off into space, or all sorts of things that really affect everything just about. I like finding a comic where they can carve out their own little corner of the shared superhero universe. That's what I enjoy. I loved Marvel a few years ago when guys like Jonathan Hickman, Rick Remender, and Ed Brubaker were working on titles like X-Force, Fantastic Four, even Avengers, and Captain America, and they were able to mostly tell their own long-term story. Some characters might cross over, but it wasn't like those stories were necessarily impacted by these big sweeping changes that things like Civil War and now Civil War II are doing. But let's first focus on just this issue. Let's see how many tropes it hits, and then we'll look at the bigger picture afterwards. Even though this is issue 1, there was an issue 0, which essentially set up that a new Inhuman was created. Now, Inhumans, just in case you haven't heard, are essentially, they're human beings that have alien DNA in them from experiments that were done like way, way, way in the past. And the Inhumans have had these alien genes activated, giving them powers. So not every Inhuman has his powers unless they're exposed to something called the Terrigen Mists. And they were a very insular society, a secret society that the Fantastic Four encountered. And they were pretty much supporting characters for a very, very long time in Fantastic Four. These days, Marvel seems to have this editorial mandate. Nothing's been officially said, but it certainly seems to be an editorial mandate that they don't want to push any stories with Fantastic Four or X-Men in terms of creating new characters and big new events with those characters because they don't have the film rights to those, where they have the film rights to all their other characters. They downplay those characters, and therefore they're pushing the Inhumans as almost a new type of X-Men. I don't think it works. The X-Men work because they are the other. They could represent any type of minority character as well as being superheroes. They're born that way. Inhumans do have something inside of them that makes them different, but it has to be activated. And their entire past history is them deciding to be their own separate society. That's not as relatable. We can all feel like the other, no matter what. We're something that isn't, the normal, that isn't everybody else. We're something. Even if we're just awkward teenagers, we feel like the other. But Inhumans don't quite fit that. And it's a little frustrating to see Marvel push them so hard. Well, they are a massive part of this story because in issue 0, a college student was exposed to the Terrigen Mists and he seems to be able to see the future. We're going to learn a little bit more about that as the story begins. In the first couple pages here, he's running scared and the Inhuman royal family, the leaders of the Inhumans, find him. Some of these characters are pretty well known, like Medusa right there in the center. We've got Triton and Crystal, who are long-term Inhumans. Then we've got Reader. He's that sort of blind guy with the weird glasses and the dog. He was sort of adapted on that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show, but they just called him Gordon, and he would just teleport. Reader in the comics is way more powerful. Anything he can read, he can make happen once, maybe twice a day. So he has these Braille cards, and if he reads them, he can do big, epic stuff. But then, bizarrely, the Inhumans now also have on its team Beast from the X-Men and Human Torch from Fantastic Four. Because, as I said before, they're sort of downplaying those teams. Now, they want to retain the rights to those characters. They're still going to be published and show up. But they're not going to necessarily have their own groundbreaking new stories that would give material to new movies. My opinion. So we cut to a couple weeks later, and the current team of the Avengers is all reeling from something. They're in some big battle, and right off the bat we have a couple Bendis tropes. We have Spider-Man saying, "This is crazy, right?" Iron Man replies, "Oh yeah." "I mean, even by your founding member of the Avengers standards?" Iron Man repeats, "Oh yeah." Repeat dialogue. Such a Bendis trope, and sometimes it works, but as soon as you're aware of it, it can sometimes also be slightly distracting. Not the worst thing, whatever, it's a trope. The word crazy is something Bendis throws around very casually. He very frequently has his heroes call their enemies crazy. I don't know why that word makes such an impact with him, but he uses it a lot, and it shows up 3 times on this page. First, Spider-Man says, "This is crazy." Then he says, This feels really crazy to me. Finally, Nova, his teammate, says, "You're never alone with the crazy. Whatever they're fighting, it's crazy." And then we get this badass 2-page spread. Check this out. I guess they're up against a Celestial. In the Marvel Comics universe, Celestials are basically giant space gods. They're just unknowable. You can't communicate with them because they're so far above us, and they go around judging whether planets should live or die. Big cosmic threat. And the artwork here is fantastic. It's really exciting. I love it. Of course, this threat is way too big for 5 or 6 Avengers. It's just unknowably massive. But here we get a big splash page where pretty much every major Marvel superhero shows up. Not all of them, but almost all of them. All heroes. I mean, that is definitely a crossover trope. And it's what you want to see. It's what you hope to get out of a crossover. So no complaints there. That's pretty awesome. I absolutely love David Marquez's art. It's really, really cool stuff. He's got very solid storytelling, panel to panel. It's very clear. He's got great gesture, great expression. There's a lot to like about this art. I'm going to nitpick something, so I wanted to pay him a bunch of compliments first, because he's great. This is a real minor nitpick. But we've got all these superheroes jumping forward, and a lot of them, of course, can't fly. In fact, we can see that characters like She-Hulk and Captain America actually have jetpacks on so that they can be flying. But then you have some characters like Spider-Woman, Squirrel Girl, Old Man Logan, Colossus. Why not give them a jetpack? I remember that George Perez was famous for these big, tons of superhero either posters or splash pages. He's done a ton of them. And he said in interviews that he always gave a lot of consideration to placement. Like, you can always get away with having flying superheroes up above. You can have acrobatic characters like Spider-Man and Nightcrawler sort of in the middle. But you can't just place a guy up in the middle of the sky. I would argue that David Marquez sort of cheats in this panel. I mean, it looks cool, but if you're going to analyze it for sort of a grounded realism, it's not to be found. Again, that's a pure nitpick, not a complaint. We get a single page of all the superheroes fighting some sort of creatures in the middle of the air. I'm not 100% clear on what's going on there. I would guess that the Celestial has some sort of minions, but again, it's just a guess. So a big action-y page. And then Doctor Strange and all the other supernatural characters are conjuring a spell, and then the next page it works. So yeah, we hit a couple tropes here. First of all, as the spell works, we've got a 2-page spread of panels. That's something Bendis likes to do, and there are actually 4 of these in the book, as well as 2 splash pages. That's not a complaint. I mean, a big event, I think they like to try to go with sort of more big, open, cinematic type shots. So I see what they're doing there. It works for me. We also have an aspect here that's slightly troublesome to me, not majorly so. It's just that Bendis really likes to introduce formally tough, formidable foes and have them dispatched easily. It's almost like in wrestling when somebody starts winning, and it's just to make them sort of look good, make their overall menace a little stronger. So, I mean, I guess he's trying to show that the superheroes are in a really functional, powerful place right now. It's a decent place to start the story, but we're given hardly any description of how this Celestial sort of showed up or what his exact plan is. So we don't really know what the threat was. Was he, judging the world? Was he doing something a little different because he had all those minions? And exactly what did it take to make this threat go away? As in, why couldn't the superheroes always do this? What made it unique or special? None of that's really looked at. So that's a trope of a formerly tough foe being pretty easily vanquished. I mean, we're barely into the story, and we've beaten a Celestial, one of the toughest threats in all of Marvel. Bendis hits us with a little bit of his sort of patented teen speak. Like I said before, he loves dialogue. He loves dialogue. You're going to see a lot of it here, and I'm just trying to boil it down. We've got people that just sort of repeat what was just said. We've also got this where teenagers sort of talk in maybe not necessarily a realistic way, but still somehow a believable way. And that specifically is this. Nova is a teenager. He flies in and says, "Hey, who gave us a heads up on this? How did we know it was coming?" Captain America says, "Let's get down to the street and help with the cleanup." Nova replies, "Okay, ignore me." Teen speak. It's funny to me. I like it. I don't love this next moment. Bendis is guilty of sometimes, in my opinion, writing dialogue that feels out of character for someone. And he does this for one of two reasons: to move the plot forward or to make a joke. And I think that he's making a joke here. For me, knowing these characters, it falls flat. Let's just read it together. We've got Captain Marvel and Iron Man, the two main characters in this story. But here's what they say to one another. "You reading anything? Sky is clear. Drinks are on you then. Drinks are definitely on me." Okay, so Captain Marvel and Iron Man are the two most famous alcoholic superheroes, possibly bar none, certainly in the Marvel Universe. They've each gone through storylines where they had to deal with an addiction to alcohol. I don't think they would casually be saying drinks are on you, drinks are definitely on me. It just doesn't ring true to me. I don't think that something that serious, because it caused each of them to be drunk as superheroes and cause collateral damage, I don't think they'd be joking about that. I think that they could joke around. I don't think they joke about that. Speaking out of character. That one hurts. I'm not an alcoholic that I know of. I'm hitting a lot of tropes here. Calm. We've got a lot of stories still to get through. We're only about a quarter of the way through. Let's keep reading. All the superheroes go and have a little party at Stark Tower in Manhattan. That's fine, that's cool. It's actually not something we always get to see, the celebration after a big victory. Feels believable. We are hit with a wall of text as everybody just sort of banters about. I'm not sure that that's the most efficient way of moving this story forward, but I do understand the need to, again, establish these heroes are at the top of their game right now. They've beaten one of their biggest threats. They all get along, including the fact that they're celebrating with the Inhumans, who are traditionally a little bit more removed. But people are starting to ask, like, how did we know this massive threat would come here? Medusa, as leader of the Inhumans, pulls aside a few of the superheroes to explain to them what just happened. It's a little weird to me that they don't seem to now trust everybody, because not everybody is pulled into this room. There's no discussion about it, but, you know, we can gloss over some of that stuff. Okay, so let's find out what Medusa has to say. How did they know about this threat? She introduces Ulysses, and he explains that he has the ability to see the future. Okay, this is absolutely a concept worth exploring. Determinism versus free will. Always interesting. Always interesting. Putting characters on either side of the issue, I'm not as sure that that's the right way to explore this as compared to someone sort of dealing with finding themselves in a situation. Maybe they believed in one or the other, and now they seem to be facing the opposite. For instance, they even joke about this later in the series. It's Minority Report. If you've ever seen that movie, it's about cops who arrest people before they've committed a crime. Tony Stark thinks that they should learn how his powers work, and I think that that makes sense. They decide to call in Jean Grey. This is the young Jean Grey of the X-Men. This is going deep into the weeds if you're not up to date, but basically Beast brought forward in time the original 5 X-Men from back when they were teenagers to the modern day in an attempt to sort of slow down current day Cyclops from being so militant. Interesting enough, and it's great to see the original team, but they've been out here in the present for years at this point, years in our time, in story time. Kind of a long time to let that one linger, especially where that seems to involve people from the past now knowing a ton about the future, which some of these characters in Civil War have an issue with. But it's not even addressed that these characters should at some point be sent back to their time and they would have all this knowledge of future events. Why is that not an issue? How is that not even addressed? Calm. We're not even to the main conflict yet. In fact, here's something kind of weird. Captain America asks, oh, don't the Inhumans and the X-Men have a conflict? Should we bring Jean Grey in here? Tony Stark says, it's a party. They gloss right over the issue. This makes me think that this story was done more for editorial reasons than for having a good idea. We know that this was timed to coincide with the release of Captain America Civil War. I think that the comic book was absolutely intended to capitalize on that. That's fine. But I don't think that they started thinking of this idea like a year ahead of time. It seems more like a couple months ahead of time. And the reasons I think that bears out is they've dealt with constant delays, and on top of that, ongoing issues in the story. They seem to not really know what will shake out. Like, they're just like, oh, there's a rift between the Inhumans and X-Men, but we're just going to ignore that for now. We're just going to set all that aside. A little weird. Makes me think that this was editorially dictated. Jean Grey tries to read his mind to understand how Ulysses' powers work, and she finds she can't read his mind. For some reason, she just can't. This issue of a superhero having precognitive abilities is suddenly so important to everyone, but it doesn't ring true to me because there have been plenty of other clairvoyant superheroes and supervillains in the past, and no one's ever made an issue out of it. Not like this. There needs to be some sort of bridging dialogue or scene to explain what makes Ulysses so unique compared to Destiny, Madam Web, Firebird. These are all characters that could see into the future. I don't know. I think that that's an issue, that they don't even address things like this. Because if a fan like me is thinking of it, I'm sure there's tons of fans that are thinking of it, and it's never addressed, and it's never answered. I think that that's an oversight. At this point, Captain Marvel and Iron Man start having very different ideas about how to deal with access to Ulysses. Captain Marvel asks right off the bat, are you exclusive to the Inhumans, or would you be interested in joining my team, the Ultimates? I think that makes all the sense in the world. The Ultimates have been going for several months before this. I think like 6, 7, 8 issues at least had come out at this time. She's the leader. Their goal was specifically to proactively address problems before they became problems. They were going out investigating, just how the universe operates. We've got some of the best minds like Blue Marvel and Black Panther and very powerful people like Captain Marvel going on these adventures. But there's a difference between being proactive and literally, of course, operating on information that you think tells you how the future is going to come. But I think it's in character. I think it's absolutely in character for her. I don't think it's as in character for Tony Stark, a futurist, to be like, no, we should not be, going after people before something happens. And he actually does have a good argument, though. He specifically says, well, look, he doesn't actually tell the future. He tells a possible future because he saw a future in which this Celestial destroyed Earth. Well, the Celestial didn't destroy Earth. Because we knew that, but that didn't happen, so he obviously can't know the future. He can know a potential future. That's a really important distinction to have right off the bat, and I think it makes it kind of obvious who we should be siding with. Plus, I think that we're always, as people, going to want to side a little bit more with the free will argument as compared to this is fate, it's going to happen. You know, Captain Marvel thinks there's a way to sort of cheat fate. Kind of weird that it's so important to them all of a sudden. Tony's trying to argue why they shouldn't necessarily act on this information. Here's his example. Okay, let's say the guy here comes running up to us and says, "Oh my God, I just had a vision of the Hulk making out with Ultron, and a baby popped out, and the baby was a reincarnated Hitler." Do we stop the Hulk before that happens? Do we lock him away before he does something we don't like? Problematic. Very problematic. Here's why. Tony Stark used to be part of a group of really smart superheroes that called themselves the Illuminati. They would try to shape the world secretly. It's kind of insidious stuff, actually, for superheroes, but that's okay. That's a little interesting. That's conflict. One thing they decided to do was to trap Bruce Banner, send him off into space, because they felt that the Hulk was too big a threat and he couldn't stay on Earth. So he proactively did that once. He got rid of the Hulk. The Hulk got mad and came back very mad, and they paid for that because Hulk beat them all up. And yet, here Tony is using the Hulk specifically as his example of what if. What if there was a problem with the Hulk? Doesn't seem to work for me. That's why I'm thinking that maybe Iron Man was not the right character to have oppose Captain Marvel. Again, I think it's an editorial dictate. He's the most popular character in the movies. He's got to be on the other side of this debate. Doesn't seem to fit, though. They're forcing a square peg into a round hole. Tony and Carol start arguing really fast. And here's what's also weird. Nobody else in the room is saying anything. Spider-Man and War Machine, Captain America, they might have like a line, but basically they're all just hanging back, just sort of watching. Not very, whatever. Let's set that aside. I would have just had them walk off on their own if they're going to have a debate between just the two of them. But they get into a pretty fiery debate right off the bat, but they don't pay any of it off. For instance, Tony says, "What if Ulysses tells us you are a danger to the future? Do we stop you before you cause a problem?" Captain Marvel says, "Depends." Tony asks, "On what?" Just cut to a panel where they're staring at each other. That's a really good question. Depends. Depends on what? Not answered ever in the whole series. Anyway, they're not coming to a conclusion, and they just walk away. It just ends. You'd think that they'd want to resolve that debate and firmly agree on specifically who is going to do what. They don't. So the issue is still dangling. We see Ulysses have a nightmare. He's had another vision. And then we cut to Tony Stark. We're not clear on exactly how much time has passed, but time has passed. And his assistant, MJ, tells him War Machine is dead. His best friend, Rhodey, is dead. I think this is tremendously disrespectful for such an important character to have him killed off panel. Like, we'll see it eventually, but to find out this way really makes War Machine look like a prop in this story, which I think he is. We haven't really gotten to know him in this issue. There was a small amount of backstory with Rhodey in Civil War #0, but that is not really touched on at all in this issue. And I think we have to look at each issue as its own story to a degree. So, War Machine doesn't really have any agency of his own. He's not making decisions. He's not proactively deciding what to do, reacting to anything. He's just a character in the background. He's dead. Why is he dead? Again, I think it feels more like an editorial decision because he's Tony Stark's best friend and he's Captain Marvel's boyfriend. At least part-time boyfriend. So they both care about this character a lot. And if he dies, I guess that's meant to be the inciting incident. But doesn't it already feel like they're already arguing? They've already formed their sides. I guess this escalates things. I really don't like it personally. I mean, it's like this. Almost any superhero out there who's been around for a long time is somebody's favorite, or at least a lot of people like him. And when you kill them off, I think you need to have a really, really good reason and tell a good story with that. And I think a good example of that is when they killed off the original Captain Marvel. He got cancer. As simple as that. He got cancer. It was a battle he couldn't fight. And there was a graphic novel by Jim Starlin that follows his final days coming to terms with the fact that he's going to die and saying goodbye to those that he loves and cares about. That's a story worth telling. That tells us that death means something. In real life, if we lose an aunt or an uncle, they're not coming back. Superhero comics sometimes don't treat that with the gravity that I think it deserves. And so in some ways, it's like I want War Machine back because I like that character, and he's been around for a long, long time. And in other ways, once a character is dead, I think it's sort of a cheat to bring them back because that's not how life works. Your mileage may vary. But killing off characters is something Bendis is not afraid to do. And certainly it's something that we can expect in a big crossover event. Here's to you, War Machine.
What you say? That it's all for the best, because it is.
Tony goes to S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, sees the body of his best friend, and he instantly gets really mad. And he's like, where's Captain Marvel? He basically seems to have already figured out what's happened, and I think the rest of us have figured it out too. When he goes to confront Captain Marvel is basically in some sort of an ICU room, and she's watching over She-Hulk, who seems to be in a coma. So War Machine is dead, She-Hulk is in a coma. They went through something big and bad. Eventually, Captain Marvel explains, Ulysses had a vision of Thanos, one of the absolute biggest threats in all of Marvel. Biggest threats. And she decided to go after him along, not just her team, the Ultimates, she also recruited War Machine. But we're just told that. We were never shown her asking War Machine to go with her. So we're just told that. Well, if she recruits War Machine, why didn't she recruit, say, Spider-Man? Why didn't she recruit Captain America? Thanos is a big threat. I understand from a storytelling point of view, she's acting on a vision and things didn't go as expected. That's fair. Why did we have to kill him off? Why couldn't he also be in a coma? Wouldn't that have basically had the same stakes, basically, for the story purposes? I don't know. Eventually, Carol explains that, yeah, it was Ulysses had a vision. We decided to act on it. We thought we would ambush Thanos. And it didn't go right. So this is definitely a change to the status quo of pretty much all Marvel comics. If this is the way some superheroes, like maybe half of them or something, are going to act, with the other half not acting that way. It may not be a lasting change, but it's a change to the status quo, and that's definitely a trope of big event crossovers. Status change. Tony angrily leaves and says that he's going to make sure that none of them play God again. And that's the last we see of him for now. The issue's almost over. Then She-Hulk starts to wake up. And what she says here is, again, in my opinion, very much out of character. She-Hulk says to Carol, "It's our future, Carol. Fight for it." She's giving her blessing to act on these visions. First of all, She-Hulk is a lawyer. She's one of the few superheroes that has, a full-time job that really she treats very, very seriously and takes up a lot of her time. She's a lawyer. She specifically is a defense attorney. She believes in the rule of law. She believes in our rule of law. She-Hulk, in issue 0, defends a super criminal who was talking with some people at a bar about potentially committing a crime, but he didn't commit that crime. Still, the police arrested him, and the jury actually convicts him. And then, just to make the story extra dark, we're told that the guy was killed in prison. Seems a little bit kind of like, I don't know, gilding the lily. It's a bit much. But that's where She-Hulk should stand, in my opinion. She believes in not arresting people until they've committed a crime and then trying them for specifically what they did. Now all of a sudden she's like, yeah, go arrest people, go arrest super criminals before they have a chance to commit a crime. But why? Just because she got injured? That doesn't ring true to me. It doesn't. More drinky. So that's basically the issue. I would say that we hit 2 more tropes that we can only really realize as we have finished this issue, and that's this. We're clearly pacing the story for the trade. I think that you'd have to agree that the pacing in this is very strange in terms of there's not a lot of fighting a big threat. There's definitely a lot of talking about it, a lot of debate, but people just completely ignore other people's arguments and just drop them just to move the story forward. So it's sort of this stop-start thing. It feels like it hasn't been thought all the way through, but we're going to like tell this story in, you know, this many issues that can be published in a trade paperback. We're going to, you know what? This is going to be a 2-parter. Next week, I'm coming back. We're going to discuss story structure. We're going to look at the entire Civil War II story and look at story structure and see where specifically it's making mistakes, in my opinion. But that opinion will be backed up by what a lot of experts in writing will call good story structure. Anyway, so we've got writing for the trade, and we've also got Bendis trope fighting in less than 25% of the issue. The only fight we had, really, was the very quick fight against the Celestial, and then 1 page showing that Thanos killed War Machine. So 2 more tropes. 9 of Bendis's tropes, 2 more of the 3 that I could think of for big event crossovers. It's a decent amount of tropes. You know, it's an extra big issue, but that's a lot of tropes to hit. Your mileage may vary. This issue sold a lot, and it continues as a series to sell well. So maybe a lot of people like this. I find it a little depressing when you make your protagonist and your antagonist both superheroes that somebody cares about. I think that you can absolutely derive conflict from having people that you like on opposite sides of an issue. They can fight, that's great. But ultimately, if there's not sort of a villain controlling things from behind the scenes, spoiler, I don't think that there is. We'll know next week when I get the final issue and I can review the entire run. I don't think that that's fair. I don't think that this rings true to me. But maybe you do like it. And if so, I would be very curious to hear what you do like about it. I think that there's some fantastic art, no question. I think that the topic that they're covering is very interesting. And I do think that there is some funny one-liners in there. So it's not all bad. But overall, the idea of having superheroes fight each other I find a little depressing. Anyway, this is to be continued. Next week, we're going to look at the entire Civil War II story and take a look at storytelling theory and see, does it follow a structure, or is it kind of just mandated from on high that certain things have to happen and therefore they happen? Well, we'll find out next week. I hope you'll come back and see me then.